Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the ConTinual panel room. Tonight, we're discussing writing, lawyers, and the law. I'm your host, Nancy Northcott, and I do have a disclaimer before we dive into this. Nothing said by anyone on this panel should be construed as legal advice in any form, nor should it be considered to create an attorney-client relationship with any of the attorneys on the panel. And so with that out of the way, we'll start by asking the panelists to introduce themselves, tell us a little about their involvement with the law, and if they write, what they write. Michael, will you start?
Sure. My name is Michael A. Ventrella. I write fantasy and science fiction, and I've also edited a bunch of different anthologies, about 12 anthologies so far. My most recent novel is called Big Stick. It's a steampunk adventure with Teddy Roosevelt and Mark Twain and Harriet Tubman. And I am a lawyer in Pennsylvania. I'm a criminal defense attorney who's in courtroom almost every single day.
Okay. Matthew?
I'm Matthew Saunders. After law school, I practiced law for about 7.5 years. Hated every second of it. I did a lot of employment law. I did a lot of government law. I worked for excuse me. I worked for law firms that represented school districts for a while. Now I do regulatory compliance for a bank, which is legal-ish, but not actually practicing law. And I actually enjoy that much better. I write mostly historical fantasy. My latest book is set in the 1960s about a small South Carolina town having to deal with a werewolf infestation.
Okay, Kim?
Hi, I'm Kim Fielding. I am a licensed member of the Nebraska Bar, which does me no good because I live in California, where I've been teaching criminal justice for the past 29 years. I'm going into my 30th year of that. So most of my law stuff has been on the more education type and research type of side of that. From a writing perspective, I write science fiction, fantasy, horror, and gay romance.
Lisa?
Hi, I'm Lisa Macklem. I'm actually more of a legal scholar than a practicing attorney. So and I'm also Canadian, so I'm a little bit of an outsider that way. So I have a JD with a specialty in information technology and intellectual property. I did my master's of law in Los Angeles in entertainment and media law at Southwestern Law School. And I'm currently struggling through a PhD back up in Canada. I also teach business law, so I sort of have my fingers in a lot of pies, and most of my legal writing is for, or most of my writing is actually for conferences. So I also have an MA in media studies, so I do a lot of academic work in media studies, but also going to legal conferences around the world.
Okay. And I practiced law 18 years. I mothballed my license some years ago and have been happy with that change. I write several different kinds of things: historical fantasy, romantic suspense, science fiction, and paranormal romance. I haven't written anything legally themed in a really long time. So let's pick up the actual discussion with misconceptions that we've seen play out in books and other popular media about lawyers and the practice of law. Matt, will you start?
I have a list. But I'll be brief. The things that kind of irk me about the portrayal of lawyers in media, and I'm thinking mostly television shows that now, because that's mostly what I have experience with in lawyers being portrayed, is with trials and presentation of evidence and everything. I think the one major thing that the reason that I stopped watching Law and Order was the thing where they have a witness on the stand and they're being questioned, and the lawyer asks the question and the witness answers it, and then the lawyer does this little side comment thing to the jury about the answer, and then the opposing counsel objects, but before the judge can rule in the objection, they just go withdrawn, whatever, and like, that's not a thing. Like you can't do that. And it's not the most important thing, but like literally every single episode of Law and Order, they would do that at least once. And that's, you get a mistrial that way if it's bad enough, if your little side comment is bad enough. You know, you get your opening statement and you get your closing statement to make your grand eloquent speeches. But while the witness is giving their testimony, you don't get to make editorial comments on it. And you know, that just the different things like that, like the whole like you know, surprise witness that shows up at the end of the trial, like that's not a thing either. You know, you can't do that. You have to let opposing counsel know about that, you know, before it happens. And it just things like that, like you know, it makes for very dramatic television and very dramatic movies, scenes and things like that. But in real life, that doesn't happen. That's a very bad thing, and leads to mistrials and other things and sanctions and potential disbarments. So, you know, that's kind of my answer to that.
Okay, Kim.
I think one of my biggest pet peeves is the focus on trial work, and, you know, to the exclusion of everything else, especially in criminal cases. You know, the vast majority of criminal cases never go anywhere near the courtroom. And you know, if you watch TV or even a lot of books, the lawyers are spending all of their time in court, in trial, and that's just not realistic. And the rest of the time, they're just kind of wandering around looking fashionable, which is also not very realistic in my experience. So you know, just this very skewed idea of how especially the criminal justice system works, and where most of the efforts go. I know it's boring on TV to watch somebody, you know, sitting in front of Westlaw. That's not very exciting, but that's the reality of it.
Lisa?
I would echo a lot of the same things, like the evidence that suddenly comes out of like left field and it's like just thrown in, and, you know, no notification or anything like that. That drives me crazy. Or the leading questions like everywhere, right? And I, as Kim said too, I mean, the fact that they don't really spend any time on like what lawyers really do, right? I mean, I'm sure we're going to talk specifically about specific shows eventually, but I'll just throw this out there. Like, I watched the first 15 minutes of Suits, I think, and then I turned it off and never came back. It's like, I'm sorry, you can't pretend you went to law school. And just because you like memorized all the books, you can pretend you're a lawyer. I'm sorry, that does not happen. So that was my big pet peeves, I think.
Okay. Michael?
Well, admittedly, I don't watch very many of these kind of shows because I live it. I don't need to watch it, you know, so I don't have a tremendous amount of experience. If you wanted to make a realistic show, you know, 80% of the show would be a lawyer sitting in front of a computer screen surrounded by books. But no one wants to see that, you know, and we don't want it to be realistic because that's boring. Any fiction should not be too realistic. I don't want to have a scene where they go to the bathroom, and I don't want to have a scene where they go to sleep and you wake up the next morning. You know, we cut all the boring stuff out. So that part doesn't bother me that much. It's not realistic, but it's fiction. The unrealistic parts are when they only have one client. You know, they have one case and one client and no one else ever is calling them. And how do they pay their bills? I'd like to know that. The worst is there's a TV show, one of those superhero shows where the superhero is a lawyer and he only takes cases from innocent people. Well, gosh, if they're innocent, why are they being charged? I mean, I can think of only a few examples in my entire career where I had people who were absolutely, completely innocent, you know, and I fought very hard for those people, but because they come around so rarely. That bothers me a bit. As a criminal defense attorney, the one that gets me most is the reading your rights as soon as you're arrested. When the police in the TV shows, as soon as they grab someone, you have the right to remain silent, blah, blah, blah. And that's not what happens in real life. And so many of my clients come to me and saying, can you get the charges thrown out? He never read me my rights. I said, well, were you interrogated? Well, he stopped me and he arrested me and he didn't read me my rights. And he doesn't have to at that stage. And I'm constantly after telling my clients that that doesn't count, or that any other loopholes don't count. You know, he said my car was blue, but it's actually green. No, you're not going to win a case on that. I'm sorry.
Well, you know, what you just said reminds me of the tendency. When I was still practicing, they did a CLE presentation on streamlining legal writing and saying things like the plaintiff was operating his motor vehicle in a westerly direction on Ensign Boulevard at approximately 5:17 p.m. for his green 1978 Ford GTO or whatever it is. And people were jumping up and down in this seminar saying, you don't need all those details, just drop them. But it's like one of those things that had become traditional. And so people perpetuated it because the lawyers they learned from perpetuated it. And
Can I address that?
beg pardon?
Can I talk about that for a second?
Absolutely.
I actually have taught courses to my local lawyers in CLE classes about how to write a good brief, because too many lawyers write briefs that put you to sleep. And I'm sitting there saying, you know, the Superior Court and the Supreme Court get tons of these things and you need to stand out. And so I write my briefs more like I'm writing a story. Here's what happened. This is what happened to my client. Oh my God, isn't that terrible? There's been an injustice. You can fix it, ladies and gentlemen of the Supreme Court. You know, and you write it in a way that makes them want to read it, just like a book. And I got to tell you, I had so much blowback from lawyers telling me that was ridiculous. And then I kept saying, but I keep winning. Maybe it's good.
The bottom line. Yeah, Lisa.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in and talk about that a little bit too. I actually worked as an extern for a studio in Los Angeles, and the lawyer who I was writing, briefs for and so on, was always being in front of the same judge, right? And I think that's something that needs to sort of be addressed too, right? Is that every judge is, particular in what they actually want to see, right? And so, I mean, he would have us put in so many precedents because this is what the judge keyed into, right? So I think like that the whole knowing your audience thing, even for legal writing, is like super important for sure.
Well, isn't that one of the basics of persuasion theory? Know your audience. So let's go back to the last minute surprise, amazing evidence. Why doesn't that happen for those who are getting ready to write a legally themed story and we're planning to do that? Let's explain to them why that doesn't work. Kim, will you start?
Sure, because you have to give the opposing side the opportunity to see that evidence and evaluate its accuracy, its reliability, and you can't do that in front of the jury. So yeah, I guess there are some occasions when I don't know, maybe some of you have had some, since I don't practice, it may occasionally happen, but you have to have a really damn good reason for that thing coming in right then and there.
Would anybody like to amplify that?
I mean, the only exception I've ever seen, and it doesn't actually happen to me, but I know it happens is if it's a piece of evidence that you didn't know about in the discovery period of the case, which is when for the non-lawyers who are listening to this, it's the part of the case before the trial where the lawyers are supposed to exchange all the evidence they're using, and if you don't give the other side the evidence you want to use, you can't use it. But sometimes things come up that you didn't know about, but even then, you don't get to present it in front of the jury for the first time. You still have to go to the judge and you have to go to opposing counsel and say, hey, I found this, and give them an opportunity to evaluate it, and sometimes the judge, even at that point, can say, no, actually, you can't bring that in because you should have known about that and you didn't. And it's your fault because you were negligent. And it's not fair to the other side for you to bring that in now. So even at that point, it's kind of dicey to have surprise evidence or whatever it is. So that's it's always interesting to see shows and movies and things like that try to do that, because it's never, the surprise witness kicks open the doors in the back of the courtroom and strides in and everyone's in awe of what's going to happen. It's like, no, that just doesn't happen. It's great TV, it's great entertainment, but it doesn't happen.
I agree. And I think it's important to point out that people have the impression that trials are a game in a way. where you're not showing each side, but really we go into a trial knowing what the other side is going to do. I mean, I can pretty much predict what the DA is going to say and what kind of questions he's going to ask, and I prepare my clients appropriately. And it's rare that it doesn't happen the way we expect. Really, what we're doing is we both know what the facts are. It's just we're presenting it to a jury in the best light we can for them to make the decision based on all the evidence we already have. It's not a surprise situation. Sometimes witnesses will say things that surprise us, but that's different, and that certainly happened to all of us, I think.
Well, let's talk about the mechanisms for finding out what each side has. What's your favorite? Lisa, do you have a favorite form of discovery?
I haven't unfortunately had a lot of personal experience with discovery. I've gone through discovery materials and cataloged them for people, but that's really the length and breadth of my experience, unfortunately, with that. So,
okay, Michael.
Obviously, there's a motion you can make at the beginning of the case saying, give me discovery, and they have to give you it. And if they don't give you everything, like if the police report mentions a video and you don't get the video, you can make a motion and say, give me the video before the trial, et cetera, et cetera. So you have a legal way to get everything. And if they don't give it to you, like Matthew said, you can keep it out. My favorite thing these days is social media. I'm able to do some of that research myself, but we've also hired investigators from time to time, and you will be surprised what kind of things people can post on social media. All the witnesses that are going to say terrible things about your client, you go on social media and they've got all kind of stuff I can use against them. And I have. So that's the big change to me in the racing history.
Matthew?
It's interesting. My thing, when I was practicing, the thing that I actually didn't mind so much is my specialty, especially in California. And this is, we were talking about, maybe talking about differences in jurisdictions and everything. In California, when I practiced there, was very motion driven. So it was more focused on writing than, say, South Carolina, which was where I also have practiced, which is very talking in front of the judge and arguing in front of the judge, as opposed to the judge reading the motions themselves. I did a bunch of motion. I did motions for summary judgment, which means that after the discovery period, after you've gathered all the evidence and exchanged all the evidence, you make a motion. If you look at all the evidence and say, okay, if everything that the opposing counsel says is true, we still win. And so that was my thing. That was my specialty when I practiced in California, was writing those. And those, that part I actually didn't mind so much. Those were kind of fun because it was kind of a logic puzzle at that point. And so that's kind of not answering your question, but it's taking all the different pieces. It's taking the depositions. It's taking the document exchanges. It's taking the interrogatories, which is when you ask the other side questions and you say, just basically like or request for admissions, like admit that X, admit that Y, things like that. You take all of that and you kind of gather it together and you sort of try to piece together a narrative, and which is kind of what Michael was saying before. You piece together this narrative and you're saying, okay, taking everything that we have, taking everything, even if everything the other side says is true, we still win because we still have the law on our side.
It just doesn't make good television.
That was the fun part for me,
yeah.
And I think that kind of feeds into the whole writing thing too, like writing novels and fiction and things like that. You're building, you're just the same kind of part of your brain. You're building a narrative and you're telling a story. So that was what the part I actually did enjoy.
Kim, what about you?
I think, what I like is that sometimes even in something like the discovery process, there's the potential for sort of dramatic tension or humor. There was a case probably 40 years ago as an antitrust case against, I think, IBM at the time. And, computers were in their infancy, and IBM was just dragging its feet all throughout the discovery process and didn't want to hand anything over. And, back then, everything was still paper. It wasn't electronic files. And they were just dragging their feet. And suddenly they stopped and they said, okay, you want our stuff? Here, have our stuff. And they basically opened up the doors and told I guess it was probably the Justice Department. You can come in and have whatever you want, but you're going to have to find it. And they ended up having to hire several people who did nothing but stand there all day long making copies of every piece of paper IBM had in their files, which I imagine was a lot. And I mean, regardless of what we think about IBM or antitrust, that's funny. I mean, that's just, I mean, there's a story there, and I think that's great.
Well, and I never did any kind of criminal discovery. I did do civil discovery. And things have been mentioned, and I'd just like to sort of summarize them for those who are watching who are not familiar. And if I leave anything out, somebody jump in. Matthew mentioned interrogatories and requests for admission. There's also a request for production of documents. There's depositions where you sit down and take a witness's testimony under oath, and both sides are there and can cross-examine, and you can make objections, which the judge will then later rule on. You can also do something called a motion in limine to keep out a particular piece of evidence because it's too prejudicial or it's not probative or whatever. And the judge has the final say in that. But I don't know anything about criminal procedure. Is it, Michael, do you just say, give me everything, or do you go through a similar process?
No, it's more like give me everything. And if you know that there's something else out there that they probably have access to, you can demand it separate. For instance, they don't always give me the videos from the police vehicles. And I have to say, look, I know there was a video taken, give it to me. And usually they will. But sometimes I have to go to the judge and say, recently I had to do that over medical records because the victims were claiming they were hurt so badly and therefore my client should be charged with aggravated assault instead of simple assault. And I said, well, let's see the medical records. And we don't have them. Then how can you make this claim? That kind of thing. So I had to demand that. But normally, yeah, they turn everything over. At least in my area, I haven't had that much of a problem. I used to practice in Massachusetts as well, and it's pretty much the same thing.
I think the one difference is, in a criminal case as opposed to a civil case, the discovery process is a bit more sort of one directional in that, in a civil case, both sides have to share pretty equally. In a criminal case, the defense does not have that obligation to turn stuff over to the prosecutions.
Unless it's an alibi witness. Otherwise, yeah, I mean, the defense has a right to remain silent, which means including producing evidence. But at the same time, if I want to introduce documents or things, I kind of have to put that over, generally speaking, yeah.
But you don't necessarily have to volunteer the information that it's there.
Correct.
Well, and Michael mentioned recordings. You can get those through request to produce. Through interrogatories, you can say who has knowledge of the facts that you're alleging, who people phrase it differently from person to person. But that's how you get the information, is you ask for it and you file these with the court. You don't just mail it to opposing counsel, so that everything is in the court file when the case comes to trial. What do you all think about books and movies in which opposing counsel have affairs while working on the case? Stipulate that.
That's what makes drama. I mean, I'm not going to complain. If you wrote a story about most of my trials, they'd be boring, with a few exceptions. I don't have affairs, so that's not going to make things interesting, but that's what makes a good fiction. So I'm not going to complain. We're reading the stories of the unusual cases. Let me point that out too, if I can.
Yeah.
Quite often people will come to me and say, can you believe this? The judge threw out this case. You saw that this woman won this lawsuit, blah, blah, blah. And I go, yeah, the reason you're reading it on the news is because there are millions of lawsuits constantly, and this one is unusual. All law is not like that. That's why it's making the headlines. And so, but then again, those are the stories we want to read about. We're not going to want to read about the normal cases.
Anybody have anything to add to that?
I was just, this is an interesting thing that we learned, but in California, it is actually not against the legal code of ethics to have a relationship with a client.
California, okay.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like they basically are, the standard is like, well, as long as it doesn't affect your ability to represent them. But of course, I mean, you can't really separate those. But yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of cases in California where lawyers have had relationships with clients and they've gone up to the bar, and the bar has said, well, there's nothing that says they can't, so we can't do anything. We can't sanction them or discipline them because there's nothing that says they can't do that. And so it's just a very interesting situation there. So yeah, so all those movies, the ones that are set in California, that's actually, halfway accurate when the lawyer starts a relationship with the client.
So LA law would be okay.
Yeah.
For those who remember LA law.
On the other side of it, so many things depict opposing counsel as just hating each other's guts and being really adversarial. And I can't speak for other jurisdictions, but I live in a pretty small county in California, and the lawyers know each other. They've worked with each other for years, and regardless of which side they're on, they're not enemies. I mean, they have a working relationship for the most part.
I'll agree with that. And the important point is, if you're practicing in the same county constantly and seeing the same people, like me and the district attorneys, I get to know them personally. We all have to keep our word because we're going to deal with them again. And so if they say something and they don't live up to their word, that's going to make it very hard for us to work with them again. So there's a bit of a trust and honesty going on between them too. It's adversarial, but not angry. No one's going to mislead anybody because they know their reputation will be worked, and nothing else if I ever broke my word about what kind of deal I would take or what I was going to do, they'd never give me another deal again, so.
And I think there's efficiency at stake. I mean, if you can't, it's exhausting to constantly be battling with one another, and it's better if you can find a good way to sort of work cooperatively, even if you're adversarial. Yeah.
Well, I think especially when you're talking about civil matters, I know my dad was a lawyer, and he did construction law. And I can remember towards the end of his career, he would bemoan, these young dukes that were coming up or whatever, or duchesses, whatever, the young lawyers that were coming up, and it was all about winning, right? Whereas it's not about winning, it's about negotiating the best deal you can for your client, right? And he had no patience for them whatsoever. So, but again, that's boring for fiction.
I started practicing in a small town, and the attitude was, you tell me what you've got, I'll tell you what I've got, and we'll try to work it out. If we can't work it out, we'll start formal discovery and all the rest of that stuff. So, because the formal discovery creates a record for the court of what's there, as I think I said earlier. But it was a very relaxed way to practice law. So, yeah, was somebody about to say something? Okay. Well, what do you like in popular media? Books, TV shows? Who does it well, do you think? Michael, you want to start?
The movie I think that is the most accurate for how criminal practice works is My Cousin Vinny.
I was going to say that too.
Yeah, all lawyers know that because that actually follows the rules pretty well. The objections are correct objections, the rulings are correct. It's done. I mean, it kind of squeezes it all together because chances are if it was a murder trial, it would have lasted a year or so, but they squeeze everything together. Other than that, it follows the rules very well. And it's a good way for trial lawyers to learn, he did a good job as a trial lawyer. He really did. He cross-examined and asked the right questions. He did his research. My Cousin Vinny is the best law movie, ironically.
I show that movie to my students every year, especially when we're talking about expert witnesses and establishing a witness. I mean, it does it's funny too, but it actually really does a great job. Mm-hmm. And
anybody else
has the discovery process in it?
I have a great show that I know none of you have seen, and it's on YouTube. It's called This is Wonderland. And it's about a young attorney and her first day in court. It's actually set in Toronto. Her name is Alice. And she basically arrives at it's a few years old now, but she arrives at the court, never having actually stepped into a courtroom. She's supposed to be she'd clerked for a judge. That was her only exposure. That was what she did for her articling, which we have to do in Canada. And that's basically an apprenticeship where you work under somebody else, either a judge or a lawyer, for 10 months after you've written the bar. Anyways, so she's supposed to meet her partner there, the guy who hired her, and he doesn't show up because he's having a mental breakdown. So she's basically thrust into court with a couple of files and told, here are your clients. So Michael, you'd love this because she has, I think, 10 clients in like the first day. She has no idea where to go to court. Her one client, they keep getting his name wrong. So they keep assuming he's a different guy under, different charges, and she has to pursue that. The DAs are obviously, like the prosecuting attorneys, are super overworked, but they still try and help out, right? They're trying to get as many things sausage through as once. It's chaos. And it ends up in mental health court as well, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like fabulous. It's so accurate. I think it's the most accurate thing I've ever seen. And I show it to all of my business law students, or I make them watch it after the first class so that they get a sense of, this is what actually happens in court. Okay, it's chaotic. It depends always on the facts and how you present them and so on. So I'm super enthusiastic about that show. The other show that I will mention that really blew me away for accuracy was actually Bull, if you can believe it. I've only ever watched like one episode because my friend loves it. And I'm like Michael, I don't usually like to watch a lot dramas because they make me crazy. But they were doing a patent case. And we're going to talk about jurisdiction later. And if you know about patents, you want to go to Texas if you got a patent case, right? That's exactly what they did. It was fantastic. Like, they followed the law, they followed how the court worked, they followed, what a smart lawyer would do. It was about jury selection. So that was a little bit woo-woo, but otherwise it was super accurate. I've never gone back and watched another episode, so I don't know about the other stuff, but the patent stuff was perfect.
Anybody else have anything to add?
I know it's not perfect, but there are certain, and it's been a while, so I may be misremembering some things, but there are certain aspects of Aaron Brockovich that are actually fairly accurate as far as, the pretrial stuff, like trying to gather up, like in cases like that, in big, class
actions.
Yeah. Just trying to gather up all the evidence, class action stuff, trying to gather up all the evidence, trying to get all the people together who were in the class, interviewing everyone about their experience. A lot of that, actually fairly accurate in that movie about how that happens, and probably partly because it was based on a true story. So they were trying to be at least partly accurate while allowing for the drama part of it.
Yeah. We watch Blue Bloods, and every once in a while they go into the courtroom on Blue Bloods. And I've never seen anything that made me go, whoa, wait a minute. But I've never practiced law in New York. And so I say that with a caveat that I've never practiced law in New York, and I've never sat on a trial in New York. So I don't know, but it seems to be fairly reasonable depiction of the way things happen on Blue Bloods. My grandfather was my babysitter for a while, and Perry Mason came on in the afternoon. And I grew up thinking that every criminal trial ended with the guilty person standing up in the back of the courtroom and confessing. And then I actually went to law school and discovered that really no, the guilty person is quite happy to not confess and let someone else take the fall, should that be the case. But Lisa mentioned jurisdiction, so why don't we segue into that? And Kim, you raised that subject originally. Why don't you kick off the discussion?
Sure. I think it's really critical for authors to make sure that they are aware of the rules in the jurisdiction they're writing about, because courtroom rules, laws, procedures vary hugely from state to state, from city to city, even from court to court within the same place. And I know as a reader, when somebody gets it wrong, I mean, that just kicks me right out. And I think a lot of people make assumptions based on the jurisdiction of TV land, and no place has that. So I implore authors, if you're gonna write that, make sure that you do your research in the jurisdiction that you're writing in. And if you're writing, even if you're writing speculative fiction, that's still a rule, you know, have some rules for your jurisdiction and make them consistent, I guess.
Anybody have anything to add to that?
One of the things that, you know, this made me think of this is that you know, when I was doing employment law, that was in California, and one of the issues is like people when a lot of people focus on, you know, federal law versus and things like that. Federal law and state law are completely different things, you know, and you can have federal courts. There's federal courts and there's state courts, and in California, it was basically considered malpractice to bring a employment lawsuit under federal law, because California state law is so much more employee friendly that you always, if you were a plaintiff's attorney representing employees, you wanted to bring that lawsuit under California state law. And so you would scramble as much as you could to find a state, you know, find a state law that you could sue under, versus a federal law. And you know, we had people who, you know, would make that mistake, and like if they had a previous attorney and then we took them on for whatever reason, they, you know, fired their former attorney, but that attorney had filed under federal law, we would try our hardest to find some state claim so we could bring that under state law. So, you know, you think people don't think of things like that when they're writing, you know, lawyers sometimes is what are you suing, you know, under federal law, or are you suing under state law, and which should you be suing under, what jurisdiction should you have there, you know, things like that. So that was an interesting thing that I learned when I was practicing, that you know, the jurisdiction matters as to whether or not you're, you know, as to the chance your client has of winning. The jurisdiction matters regardless of the facts. You know, the law might be a better, you know, might be more in their favor.
Let me just add, if I can, to any writer listening out there. It's important. You as a writer have some specialty. I don't know what you do. Maybe you're just a barista, you know, maybe, but you are an expert in coffee. And if someone wrote a story about coffee that was completely wrong, you would be thrown out of the story. So the important thing is to talk to the experts. And almost every lawyer I know would be more than happy, I've done it many times for my writer friends, to help you, because we all want to make sure it's right. And then you can always thank them in the book, and they like that too. But that's true of anything. You know, I had the questions about how the FBI works. So I found an FBI agent to help me with one of my books, and they were more than happy to help me, because everyone wants to be an expert. So if you're writing about law, contact a lawyer, please, because it's only going to get better. And if you're writing about anything, contact an expert to make it better. I guess that's a general rule that all writers should follow, I guess.
Well, since you raised the subject, what else would anybody like to suggest as a way to research the use of law and lawyers in your stories?
I just sort of actually wanted to tag on to Michael's last comment too about, you know, some of the things that I find my students have trouble with in grasping the law. So one of the things that I did with them when we were stuck online was I made them participate in forums where they had to find a news article on the topic that we'd covered that week and then discuss it, right? And I had told them, because we're in Ontario, Canada, it needed to be a Canadian article about Canadian law. And I made the you know, point quite a bit that, you know, American law is not the same. And invariably somebody would pick something that was, you know, from the New York Times or something, and I'd be like, no, the law is different. So I think that, you know, writers have to be careful about just relying on news stories, just to take it back to where we're going. And I always tell people, like, if you're going to write about something, talk to an expert. I've taught writing for years as well, on top of teaching law. But I also had an acting friend who I was talking to about, you know, writing specifically for the judge that you're in front of and things like that. And, you know, bearing in mind that judges are people too. They put their pants on one leg at a time, or they tie their shoes the same way we do, and they have a bad day, they spill coffee on themselves. So, and he's like, oh, I never thought about it like that. Yeah, no, seriously. So yeah, I think that, contacting an expert, grounding things in the reality of where you've said it is definitely key.
And I think even, if you don't happen to know a lawyer or don't know a lawyer in the jurisdiction, you reach out to someone. I was doing research for a book, and I wanted to, this isn't a lawyer thing, but it's related. I was interested in how a particular county outside my state works with identification of bodies in law enforcement. And I know how they do it in my county, but this was somewhere else. And so I just sent an email to someone in the coroner's office there. And within 24 hours, I had this very long, detailed, like they'd been waiting for somebody to ask, I don't know. And so people like Michael said, people want you to get it right, and people like to talk about their job, and lawyers love to talk about like legal problems and stuff like that for fun, and so I don't think people should be hesitant to reach out, even if you don't know someone. Do it nicely. Don't ask for legal advice for yourself, but say, hey, look, I'm working on a book, can you help me with this? And I think people find it really easy to get the help they need.
And I think too, like every county in the country basically has a bar association. And it's and a lot of them even have like on their websites, if you go, and they'll have a section of about the law for non-lawyers, and they may not get into super specifics, but there's information there. They have contact information there. And if you send them an email, like someone likely would get back in touch with you and just maybe give you even if it's not, hey, I'll answer your questions, it'll be give you some direction to go to, like where you can find the answers to the questions you want. So you reach out to the local bar association if you don't personally know any lawyers. That's another thing to do.
And you can go watch a trial.
Mhm.
In the rare exception of a hearing like in a juvenile case that's closed, you can walk into the courthouse and walk into any courtroom and sit through the trial, and that will give you a sense of the flow and the movement as the parties build their cases. We're actually coming up on time. So before we adjourn, I'd like to have everybody talk a little bit about their writing as it involves the law. Lisa, will you start?
Sure. Most of my writing that involves the law is actually sort of legal writing. So I do a lot of conference papers. I'm currently knee-deep in a dissertation, which is a book-length look at digital content delivery and how the entertainment industry sort of troubles our access to culture. I also actually write a lot of policy documents. So we've had some consultations with the Canadian government over our Copyright Act. So I've written some of those, trying to make them as exciting as possible. And I'm happy to say that I have been cited in them. I actually had an article cited in a Supreme Court case. So that's kind of the best writing I've ever done. So that was kind of exciting, but that's mostly, unfortunately, what my legal writing is kind of tied up with these days.
Okay, Michael.
Well, I write about law and politics and things like that on my blog, which is called VentrellaQuest.com. And I talk about all kinds of things. And one of the things that frustrated me as I was writing is how many people don't understand the United States Constitution. So about 2 years ago, a book came out called How to Argue the Constitution with a Conservative. And that was, it sold pretty well, and it's still available. And basically, if you want to know about the Constitution, it's a good book to read, whether you're liberal or conservative, because it'll teach you with a lot of jokes, because it's a funny book. And of course, I still write briefs and things for people and get hired to write appeal briefs for other lawyers who don't like to write.
Okay. Matthew?
I guess the closest thing I have is that I have an occult detective series called Dreadful Penny. That's set in the 1970s. It's about a woman who owns a detective agency, but her father was a police officer. And so she still knows a lot of people on the police force that were friends of her father. And so she deals with the police a lot, and she deals with a lot of those legal issues with, her own investigations and the police investigations and things of that nature, and trying to kind of navigate that space as far as what she's trying to do to solve her cases versus what the police are trying to do to solve their cases. And there's some interesting things, like her father may not have been the most ethical police officer, but he had very good reasons. So there's that's kind of probably the closest that I've come with writing about the law.
Okay, Kim.
I wrote about the law for the day job quite a bit, academic journals and books, and so I don't tend to focus on that in my other side. But I have quite a few books, I guess, that have detectives and those kinds of. They're often like paranormal, so they're I wrote a Christmas story last year where a noir private eye in the 50s was trying to get a Christmas elf back to the North Pole, so that's not, I wouldn't say that was like accurate to stuff, but I'm really proud of a novella I'll have coming out in October that's a take on Dracula. And because I've always sort of associated lawyers with vampires, one of my favorite law professors did a lecture at my first year of law school. He walked into class dressed as a vampire and gave an entire lecture about how lawyers are vampires, and it's kind of a play on that. So it's sort of a moved Dracula into LA in the 50s, and there was a lawyer involved in the original Dracula anyway, so it wasn't all that hard to get him involved. So
Well, I have a novella coming out later this summer that's set in Paris in 1803 during the Peace of Amiens, and the hero's sister and brother-in-law are in Paris, and the brother-in-law was trying to get an inventor to come back to England, and the French caught him at it and threw him in prison. So I did end up researching a little bit of 19th century French law, and they actually did have something sort of like habeas corpus, which I was surprised to discover. And then in my paranormal romance series, in the second book, the hero is charged with murder and treason, and I had to make up the legal system for the mages, which is parallel to the legal system that we have. And then in the first book, Mage Sentinel, the heroine's father is filing suit for invasion of privacy. And so I had to figure out how that would work. And I have to say, I felt more comfortable doing that having worked in a real court system, because it gave me something to draw on. But if somebody wanted to go to lunch with a lawyer and talk to them over lunch about how the courts work, you could get the same thing, because it's not like it's full of legal stuff. So before we wind up, is there anything else anybody wants to mention?
Grand juries are a sham.
All right, well, on that note, we will go around, and everybody, please tell us what you're working on and where people can find information about your work. Matthew, will you start?
So Matthew Saunders, my website is jmsaunders.com. That houses all of my social media contacts and everything else. And I'd just like to mention this Nothing But the Blood came out actually today. It's the aforementioned novel that is set in the 1960s. It's about there's a lawyer in it. He has a very minor role, but it's set in the 1960s about a school teacher and an auto mechanic who have to team up with an Israeli Mossad agent to fight a Nazi war criminal who happens to be a werewolf who is terrorizing their small South Carolina town. So that's what I've got. That's my news. So
Okay, Kim.
My most recent novel came out a couple months ago, and it's a space opera called Potential Energy, with smugglers and all the good space opera stuff. But later this year in October, I'll have a book out, the vampire, the Dracula story called Farkas, and then I also have a gay romance out called The Taste of Desert green. Those should be both be out this fall. And you could, and oh, and I'm Kim Fielding, and it's K Fielding Writes, pretty much on Facebook, web pages, all those things. K Fielding Writes.
Yeah, Lisa?
Well, I have a dissertation coming sometime probably 2 years from now. Other than that, that's really sort of what I'm knee deep in. I'll be giving a conference paper in 2 days on the Handmaid's Tale and the Testaments, which kind of has a justice theme to it. I'm looking sort of at the academic stuff in it. I'm Dean Girl 1 pretty much everywhere. And yes, that is a supernatural tie-in. Otherwise, Lisa Macklem, that's about it.
Michael?
I'm at michaelaventrella.com, but if you leave the A out, you can still go to it because it forwards to it. I have, like I said, I write humorous adventure stories. So if you like humor and you like adventure, hopefully you'll enjoy my novels. My most recent book is coming out at the end of this month, but it's an anthology I edited called 3 Time Travelers Walk Into ... And I have a bunch of stories from David Gerald and Peter David and Jonathan Mayberry and a lot of big names you've heard of. And that's going to be out at the end of the month. But you can pre-order it now.
Well, you can find me here at ConTinual. My website is www.nancynorthcott.com. The social media links are on there. I technically have a Facebook page. I technically have an Instagram account, but you will almost never find me there. I spend more time on Twitter than is probably good for me, and that's the best place to connect with me on social media. I have several things coming out this summer, but I'm not sure when. I have a paranormal romance, Second Chance at Love story coming out in June, and all the fantasy and science fiction is TBA. So I'd like to thank everybody for participating in the panel, and thank you to all the viewers. And I hope you all have lots of useful takeaways from this panel.